In 1541, the English king, Henry VIII, was declared King of Ireland, and with his new title came a brutal realisation. To control the Irish, he had to silence their songs. Fearing that these deeply rooted cultural expressions would incite a fierce rebellion, the Crown viewed native melodies as a dangerous, subversive threat. Henry VIII decreed that Irish music and poetry must be ruthlessly attacked, ordering the violent destruction of traditional harps and pipes. This violent suppression plunged the musical heritage into its darkest point. These ancient sounds would have been completely eradicated if they didn't find a way to escape the grip of the Crown. As the decades stretched into centuries, the persecution deepened through harsh penal laws, devastating land confiscations, and religious oppression. This targeting hit the native Catholic Irish, and it equally crushed the Ulster Scots, a population of Scottish Protestants who had been planted in Northern Ireland generations earlier, only to face devastating famines and discrimination of their own. Facing these dark realities, it became clear that the only way for this rich culture and its music to survive was to run, seeking a sanctuary where they could live and play their music freely. Hundreds of thousands of displaced Irish and Scots-Irish began a massive migration across the Atlantic. They eventually found their refuge nestled deep within the rugged, isolated hollows of the Appalachian Mountains. In this new frontier, which strikingly resembled the rolling hills they left behind, their threatened melodies finally found a safe place to take root. So the stage is set. We have a displaced people who have finally found the quiet isolation they were looking for. But before we follow them deep into those mountains, I want you to keep a core concept in mind for the rest of this video. When we look at history, it's easy to get caught up in the politics, the beliefs and the borders. But if we strip all of that away and just look at the culture, specifically the music, we're left with a fundamental truth. You need inspiration from somewhere. The art requires friction of some form. To understand it better, think about this hypothetically. If you put a human being in an empty room for their entire life with absolutely no contact with the outside world, they're not going to come and create a song out of nowhere. They're not going to invent a song like. Creativity doesn't happen in a vacuum. Our accents, our language, the very way we pick up an instrument, these are all inherited from the people around us, from our parents at an early age, to the relationships that we develop throughout our lives, and also the collective struggles of a people throughout history. Look at the deep, centuries-old musical ties between Ireland and Scotland, for example, or even the intertwined cultural histories of Japan and China. The common denominator here is never isolation, it's always the human interaction. Mass immigration always brings friction. When vastly different people are forced to share the same space, there is inevitable conflict. But that exact same friction also creates a cultural melting pot. They trade stories, they trade their sounds, and incredible new forms of art can be born. To understand how this happened in America, we first have to look at the brutal journey that forced different cultures to collide in the first place. Driven to the brink by devastating famines in the 1690s, soaring rents from greedy landlords, and strict religious discrimination forcing them to pay tithes to the Anglican Church, life in Ulster became unendurable for the Scots-Irish. For many, the American colonies might have represented their only glimmer of hope for survival and autonomy. Seeking this new beginning, an estimated 250,000 Scots-Irish settlers arrived in the American colonies by the 1770s. Their physical journey into the unknown was grueling, primarily taking place along the Great Wagon Road, a rugged arterial path stretching over 800 miles from Philadelphia all the way south to Augusta in Georgia. This arduous dirt track, carved out of ancient animal traces and indigenous trading paths, was potentially the most heavily travelled main road in colonial America, funneling lines of covered wagons deep into the backcountry. While the name the Great Wagon Road might sound grand and majestic, The reality of this 800-mile exile was a grueling, desperate plunge into the unknown. Far from a paved thoroughfare, this route was originally an ancient indigenous trading and warriors' path, initially carved out by the hooves of migrating buffalo herds. In the early years of the migration, the path was suffocatingly narrow, sometimes only 3 or 4 feet wide, meaning the dense, untamed wilderness literally brushed the faces of the wary travellers as they walked. For the displaced Scots-Irish, the journey was a living nightmare of physical endurance. The road conditions were atrocious, constantly shifting from deep, exhausting mud to thick, choking dust that was foully mixed with the animal waste of the massive livestock herds sharing the route. Even with the eventual use of massive, heavy-duty Conestoga wagons, the unforgiving terrain took a severe toll. Heavy wooden axles snapped, wagons broke down, and progress was agonizingly slow. A fully loaded wagon might have only covered about 5 miles a day, stretching this harrowing journey into a minimum of 2 months of pure survival. The threat of starvation and disaster loomed over every single mile. Travelers routinely faced flooded rivers that soaked their few worldly possessions, and their essential supplies frequently gave out. When sickness inevitably struck the wagon trains, there were no doctors around waiting to help them. The dead were simply buried in the wilderness as the grieving survivors stumbled onwards. Under the oppressive shroud of night, the ink-black gloom, and the unknown threats around them, these exhausted immigrants had to fiercely guard their camps. Every agonizing step taken through the dirt and desperation of the backcountry was soaked in trauma, potentially pouring even more sorrow and resilience into the melodies that they had carried with them into the Appalachian mountains. Despite the hardships, these wary travellers chose to push deep into the frontier rather than stay in the established, increasingly expensive coastal cities. The Appalachian Mountains offered isolation far away from the oppressive landlords and religious oversight that they had desperately fled. Psychologically as well, this rugged terrain felt remarkably like home. The region's rolling hills and deep hollows strikingly mirrored the beloved landscapes of Ulster and the Scottish Highlands. Here, nestled safely in the mountains, they could live according to their own traditions and finally own land in their own right. Decades later, a second wave of Irish immigrants displaced by famine arrived. This group settled differently, often taking on brutal industrial labour, adding a new cultural layer to the region. Across centuries of displacement and an 800-mile exile, these resilient people carried the threatened melodies of their homeland into a rugged cultural crucible, but preserving that ancient culture presented a severe physical problem. Moving a civilization across an ocean and down a harsh dirt road dictates exactly what survives. A crowded famine ship has no space for large cultural heirlooms. A wooden wagon as well has no room for big, delicate instruments like the traditional harp. When these displaced people packed for the harrowing ride across the Atlantic, the only pieces of culture that survived were the things that they could physically hold in their hands. The fiddle became the melodic centerpiece of this survival because of its extreme portability. It was small enough to carry on a crowded ship, yet versatile enough to perfectly mirror the deep emotional qualities of human ballad singing. In their exile, they often had to leave behind larger or outlawed instruments, such as the uilleann pipes or bagpipes. And the fiddle had another benefit too. To compensate for the loss of the pipes, early Appalachian fiddlers started using the drones on their strings, mimicking the haunting and continuous sounds of the pipes that they had missed from home, and as well as that, to project their music across noisy community gatherings and barn dances. Without the luxury of a backing band, these fiddlers adopted a harder driving edge. This rhythmic and powerfully short bow technique, known as saw stroke,
sometimes called a saw stroke. So there are no slurs, it's all ups and downs. And this looks like the simplest thing in the world, and it takes some people a lot of time just to get this. And if you do it with open strings, an A and an E, for example, if we're in the key of A, then
This completely transformed the smoother flowing melodies of their homeland into a much more rugged, percussive Appalachian sound. To truly picture why this aggressive style developed, you have to imagine the raw, chaotic environment of an 18th century Appalachian barn dance. There were absolutely no microphones or amplifiers in these remote mountain gatherings. Instead, the room would be packed with folks violently step dancing, flat-footing, or clogging in heavy work shoes, as dozens of dancers stomped out complex rhythms on rough wooden floors or amplified their steps on custom clogging boards. The sheer thunderous volume of their boots would have been absolutely deafening. The word clogging here as well is believed to originate from the Gaelic word clag, which shares a direct etymological connection with the English words clock and clack. This naming perfectly reflects the rhythmic, percussive sounds made by the dancers' footwear striking the floor. Historically, traditional Irish step dancing is considered one of the most primary parent forms of Appalachian clogging. When 18th century Irish and Scottish settlers, the Ulster Scots, migrated to the Appalachian foothills, they brought their native step dances with them. This original Celtic style of step dancing was heavily focused on rapid footwork and was characterized by a very rigid, erect upper body. As these settlers intermingled with other communities in the isolated mountain region, the dance went through a profound cultural synthesis. The rigid Irish and Scottish footwork blended with the toe-heel movements of Native American dances and the loose upper body and arm movements of African American buck dancing. This incredible cross-cultural exchange transformed the traditional Irish step dance into the more relaxed, uniquely American style known today as Appalachian clogging. But anyway, go back to imagining the sound, the wall of sound from these areas. To even be heard over this roar without a backing band, a solo fiddler couldn't really rely on delicate playing. They had to physically attack the strings by digging the bow in with the heavy driving sawstroke, a technique which was pioneered by the Scottish fiddler Neil Gow. The musician transformed the fiddle from a melodic voice into a loud percussive engine. This aggressive rhythmic sawing might have been the only way to pierce through the noise and keep the mountain communities dancing. But it wasn't just the instruments that carried the weight of their exile. The harsh realities of their journey as well shaped the actual sound of the voice. The iconic high lonesome sound that defines Appalachian music might be a direct transcendent of traditional Irish sean-nós, or the old style of singing. Sean-nós relies on an unaccompanied, highly ornamented and distinctly nasal vocal delivery, often used to express deep grief and sorrow. When we got this ancient vocal style, and it took root in the mountains there, it evolved into high, intense tenor vocals. For generations, that unaccompanied, sorrowful voice echoed across the empty hollows. The early settlers had successfully carved out a sanctuary defined by sheer physical distance from the rest of the world. But the era of quiet frontier isolation could not last. By the mid-19th century, the silence of the mountains was violently shattered by the relentless expansion of industry. The music was about to be dragged out of the lonely hills and buried deep underground. As the 19th century progressed, a devastating new wave of displacement brought a different kind of settler to the mountains. Fleeing the starvation of the Great Hunger, a massive influx of Irish Catholic immigrants arrived in America, seeking survival and an escape from the oppressive British landlord system. But in a bitter twist of historical irony, many merely traded one form of servitude for another. They were thrust into the brutal labour of the rapidly expanding Appalachian coal industry. These immigrants found themselves trapped in the oppressive grip of the company town system. The coal companies owned absolutely everything. The cramped houses the miners slept in, the tools they used, the commissaries where they bought their food. To enforce this absolute control, Operators frequently paid their workers not in cash, but in scrip, a proprietary company currency that could only be redeemed at the company store. This system effectively chained the miners to the mountain, guaranteeing that they could never save enough money to escape. Their daily lives were spent travelling by elevator deep underground, enduring long, lethal hours in the terrifying claustrophobia of the coal seams, where they constantly faced the threat of a crushing roof, collapses, and deadly gas explosions. The coal operators built the camp houses as cheaply as possible as well, packing them tightly together in the narrow mountain valleys. Inside, the shacks were tiny, poorly ventilated, and stiflingly hot. After surviving a shift in the pitch-black claustrophobia of a coal seam, the miners naturally sought out the only fresh air available, the narrow wooden porch attached to the front of the house. Because the company squeezed these houses mere feet apart from each other to maximize space, you can imagine the wall of sound coming from these areas. Now, when these Famine Irish arrived, they did not seamlessly blend in with the established mountain families. The Scots-Irish had been isolated in Appalachia for over a century. They were fiercely independent, primarily Protestant, and viewed the newly arrived impoverished Catholic immigrants with intense suspicion. This was the exact human friction we talked about earlier. Two displaced groups, sharing the exact same ancient Celtic roots, separated by centuries of history. Now they were thrust into the exact same brutal coal camps. In an environment closely monitored by armed company guards, music might have been the only thing the company didn't own. Because of this, it shifted from being mere entertainment to a vital tool for psychological survival. The music played in those camps were forced into an immediate evolution. The established Scots-Irish had preserved the older, slower, mournful ballads of the 1700s, alongside their rhythmic percussive saw-stroke fiddling, but the new Famine Irish brought a modernised sound. By the mid-1800s, music back in Ireland had evolved to feature highly complex, intricate dance tunes, specifically fast-paced reels and hornpipes. But it wasn't just the Catholic Irish and the Ulster Scots that were here. These coal towns were also shared by many African Americans, and previously before this they had taken their banjos and the percussive rhythms of their African music. But it was here that they were forced to share the cramped porches of the company towns. An African American miner playing the banjo on his steps could be heard perfectly by the Irish fiddler sitting on his own porch 3 doors down. The entire local mountain musicians absorbed this new style, adapting the blistering speed and technicality of the Famine era dance tunes into their own playing. The grueling coal camps inadvertently became a vibrant cultural melting pot, creating a marriage of circumstance forged by shared suffering. And here, the mournful, isolated Irish traditions met the complex, syncopated rhythms of West Africa brought to the camps by African American labourers who had migrated from the Deep South. The defining moment of this synthesis happened when the Irish fiddle, the melodic centrepiece of the Celtic diaspora, collided with the African banjo. When white and black musicians began sharing their music on the porches of these camps, swapping Irish bowing techniques for African percussive rhythms, they potentially birthed the first American string bands. This incredible cross-cultural synthesis wasn't just an abstract historical concept. It was a living, breathing reality forged by real people. We can see this profound connection perfectly embodied in the relationship between Arnold Schultz, an African-American coal miner and an extraordinary musician, and a young Bill Monroe, the man who would later become known as the father of bluegrass. Schultz's innovative blues-driven playing deeply influenced Monroe's musical DNA. Grounding this history in his own words, Monroe openly acknowledged how these African-American rhythms and techniques fundamentally transformed his traditional mountain music, stating, "There's things in my music, you know, that come from Arnold Schultz, runs that I use a lot in my music." Born in 1886 in Ohio County, Kentucky, Arnold Schultz was the eldest child of David Schultz, a former slave who had taken the surname of his previous owner. By the tender age of 14, Arnold was already toiling deep underground in the grueling, claustrophobic coal mines alongside his father. Yet, it was outside the pitch-black mines where his true legacy was forged. Growing up in a deeply musical family, he learned to play multiple stringed instruments and frequently performed with his relatives in the Schultz family band, playing hillbilly music for local dances and picnics. Schultz was described as a quiet, slightly overweight man who often wore a big black hat, but when he picked up an instrument, his stamina and energy could keep a crowd dancing until dawn. He was an extraordinary fiddler, but his true historical innovation might have been on the guitar. He pioneered a jazzy, complex method of playing that evolved into the famous thumb style, or Travis picking, by interpolating mind-boggling rhythm strums and passing chords, techniques he perhaps picked up from New Orleans piano players while working a riverboat deckhand. He completely transformed the guitar's capabilities. This exact method was passed down directly from Schultz to Kennedy Jones, and eventually shaped the iconic sounds of players like Merle Travis and Chet Atkins. Schultz's most profound historical impact, however, lies in the mentorship of a young Bill Monroe, who, as we said, would one day become the father of bluegrass. Monroe openly credited Schultz for fundamentally injecting the blues into the DNA of bluegrass music. He was the best blues player around in our part of the country there in Kentucky, and that's where most of the people that plays a guitar today, that's all come from old Arnold Schultz. Monroe was so struck by Schultz's brilliant use of chords and occasional use of a pocket knife for a slide guitar that he adopted many of these musical runs into his own legendary style. But Schultz's life story has a dark, tragic note to it. Despite his immense talent and the fact that he was actively shaping the future of American music, he never recorded a single note. His groundbreaking sound only survives as a ghost, echoing through the hands of the legendary musicians that he had mentored. His life was cut short in 1931 at the age of 45. While his official death certificate listed a heart condition, rumours have long circulated among family and locals that he was actually poisoned, his whiskey supposedly spiked by a jealous rival musician. For over 60 years, this foundational architect of American music rested in an unmarked grave in a segregated cemetery. It is a bitter reality that the man who helped birth an entire genre of music might have been entirely forgotten by history if not for the oral traditions and memories of the famous musicians who revered him, like Bill Monroe. Born in 1911 in the small town of Rosine, Kentucky, William Smith Monroe grew up immersed in the culture of his displaced ancestors. He remained proud of his Scots-Irish lineage, championing those surviving traditions as the absolute foundation of the high lonesome sound, the melancholic vocal style that ultimately defined bluegrass. His family lineage traced directly back to the lowland Scots who were settled in Northern Ireland during the plantation of Ulster in the early 1600s. After enduring severe famines and religious turmoil in the 1690s, those ancestors joined the mass migration to America in the 1700s. The music survived that journey. His mother Melissa played the fiddle and accordion, filling their home with traditional Southern ballads. But the most notable connection to that ancestral heritage came through his uncle, Pendleton or Penn Vandiver. Uncle Penn was a talented local fiddler. Through him, a young Bill absorbed the Scottish and Irish folk tunes that formed the absolute bedrock of mountain music. Uncle Penn also served as the bridge that would permanently alter Monroe's musical trajectory. By the late 1920s, Penn regularly played local dances alongside Arnold Schultz. This partnership introduced the teenage Monroe directly to the syncopated, blues-driven rhythms of African-American music. Schultz took the young Monroe under his wing. He gave Bill his very first paying gig, hired him to play backup guitar at all-night community dances. In those intimate late-night sessions, the mournful, ancient melodies of Monroe's Scots-Irish heritage directly collided with Schultz's innovative passing chords and blues runs. Armed with this, Monroe sought to reinvigorate old-time mountain music. He envisioned a sound that combined all the chaotic elements of the Appalachian melting pot. He took the mournful, unaccompanied Scots-Irish ballads of his youth and the driving bluesy improvisations he learned from Arnold Schultz. Then, drawing heavily on the influence of the 1840s Irish immigrants, he sped up the tempo to a breakneck, highly technical pace. He layered this rapid-fire instrumentation with intense, soaring tenor vocals. This defining vocal style, which Monroe famously dubbed the high lonesome sound, was a direct, emotional echo of melancholic, ornamented Irish sean-nós singing. In 1939, Monroe formed a new acoustic string band to showcase this revolutionary synthesis of sound. He named his group the Bluegrass Boys, in honour of his home state in Kentucky. Because this rapid-fire, culturally blended music was entirely unique, the music industry didn't have a name for it. Eventually, the genre itself took its title directly from Monroe's band, becoming universally known as bluegrass. The ancient melodies carried across the ocean on famine ships were systematically dismantled and rebuilt to fit the driving syncopated rhythms of the coal camps. We don't have to rely on written journals or historical assumptions to prove that this happened. The evidence itself does survive entirely intact. To truly understand this history, one only needs to look at the living artifacts that survived the journey, the tunes themselves. When the Irish diaspora settled in America, their ancient songs were not preserved in amber. They were actively repurposed and sharpened to fit the rugged realities of the American landscape. This allows us to trace the actual history through tangible musical examples that you can still listen to today. As it crossed the ocean and made its way into the hands of mountain musicians, it was stripped of its delicate, ornamental Irish rolls and triplets, replaced by a harder, percussive rhythmic drive dictated by the African banjo and the energetic demands of mountain dancing. This ancient Irish tune was completely transformed into the driving bluegrass reel known today as Red-Haired Boy, which remains a staple of modern bluegrass competitions. Another example of this musical lineage is the traditional Irish outlaw ballad, The Bard of Armagh.
Oh, list to the lay of a poor Irish harper, and scorn at the strains of his withered old hand.
This melody took on an entirely new American identity as it moved westward, eventually evolving into the iconic American cowboy song, The Streets of Laredo. Incredibly, the evolution of this living artifact didn't stop there. The Streets of Laredo would later morph once again, laying the melodic foundation for the classic blues standard, St. James Infirmary. This evolution extended to the darkest corners of their storytelling. When the Irish and Scottish immigrants crossed the ocean, they brought their broadside ballads with them. These were not works of fiction. They functioned as the true crime news reports of the 18th century, musical accounts detailing real, gruesome local murders, printed on cheap paper and sold in the streets. In the harsh, isolated environment of the American frontier, these true stories grew darker. The geography of the songs was violently repurposed to fit their terrifying new reality. Take the traditional Irish and British ballad The Wexford Girl, or the Oxford Girl as it's known too. The original song detailed a brutal real-life murder where a man beat his lover to death and threw her in a river to avoid marrying her. When that song hit the Appalachian Mountains, the melody survived, but the map changed. The town of Wexford, for example, became Knoxville, Tennessee. The story itself mutated into the iconic Appalachian murder ballad, Knoxville Girl. The familiar rivers of home were replaced by the dark, rolling waters of the American South. The immigrants actively used the comforting melodies of their homeland to narrate the isolation and the violence of their new American experience. These living songs and tunes prove that the music of Appalachia represents much more than mere title changes. They reflect a fundamental shift in survival, and this brings us right back to that empty room I mentioned at the beginning of the video. If the crown had never upset society and issued its decrees, and if the famines had never forced these people onto ships, this culture would have never been dragged into the mountains. If they had never been forced into the claustrophobic darkness of the coal camps alongside African American musicians from the deep south, the string band mightn't have even existed. The bluegrass mightn't have even existed. The history of all of this music proves the idea that complete isolation only freezes a culture in time. It is the friction, the forced, brutal collision of displaced people sharing the same space that creates a masterpiece. Given the scale of globalization at its current rate and the large displacement of people all over the world for so many reasons, who knows what music will be like in another 100 years? What do you think about it? There sure is a lot of new artists out there, and I don't know about you, but to me it feels like there is another folk revival of sorts going on. For Irish folk at least. Maybe it's just me, but let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I'd love to hear your take on it. And I just wanted to apologise. I had missed a week in uploading videos. I was extremely busy working on another video for another channel. It was a 5-hour-long monstrosity, but a good monstrosity at that. But from here on out, all going well, I should have a better schedule to keep videos consistently coming out. I've loads to work on, along with finally getting time to work on more members' videos for tutorials on Irish tunes. I haven't forgotten, it's just that there hasn't been enough time in the day. Once my son comes home from school, the computer and the camera is the last thing that I want to look at. So I hope you can understand that. I'll do my best anyway to keep things running along and keep new topics coming out. And over the last month there's been a good few new members joining, so I want to give you all a shout out here. Let's send a warm welcome to everybody here. Jim Striegel 5094, Marthy, Tom Purvis 1261, Jay Shaughnessy 3339, Thomas Keaton 7350, and another fat geek. I really like that name there. Don't change that. But yeah, thanks a million to everyone. If you'd like to join them, that join button down below, or check out the links in the description for more information. As I mentioned briefly, I am working on getting some tutorials put up there on the members' videos to help you learn some tunes here and there. And I should have another video coming up there fairly soon, which is a follow-on from the last one to help you learn a set. And yeah, the shop's still up there as well if you want to have a look and see any Irish music themed stuff. Hats, hoodies, t-shirts, whatever it might be, have a look, sure. You might find something you like. And if you do want any custom designs done yourself, do let me know. Reach out to me and we can work on a design that you absolutely love. Maybe it's a gift for somebody. Maybe you've had an idea for the last while, but you just haven't been able to get it done. Give me a shout and I'd love to work with you on it. Finally as well, if you'd like to join the Discord server and chat with all like-minded people about Irish music and Irish history and whatever else you want, there's a link in the description there as well for you. But yeah, anyway, that's it all for me. I won't keep you any longer. Thanks a million for watching and I hope you all have a great day. Slán go fóill. Cheers.